Always good to see you back here. I'm Matthew. Today I'm going over a case where a Sherpa team refused to continue guiding these two gym climbers. It took them 2 days to see enough, collect their fee, and walk away. After that, it was just two guys with rented crampons and a storm that was already on its way. October 3rd, 2016. Langtang Himal, northern Nepal, right where the land rises to meet the Tibetan Plateau and the air starts to thin. The trail begins in thick rhododendron forest, then opens into a cold, exposed valley that just keeps climbing towards snow. After monsoon season, the sky goes crystal clear, and the high peaks look almost close enough to touch. That is the trap. The good visibility makes everything look doable, like the summit is just a long walk away. It never works out that way. Langtang pulls in a specific kind of visitor. Not the elite mountaineers going after the big technical peaks further west. Not casual trekkers either. It pulls in people who are somewhere in the middle, physically capable, motivated, and just experienced enough to feel confident, but not quite experienced enough to know what they do not know. The peaks in this range sit between 18,000 and 20,000 feet, and budget agencies market them as achievable for fit, determined individuals. That framing attracts a certain type of person. Emmerich and Craig were exactly that type. Emmerich Fenner was 29 years old and worked as a personal trainer back in Phoenix, Arizona. His whole sense of who he was came from physical performance. Gym numbers, body composition, strength benchmarks. That was his world, and he was genuinely good at it. He was the kind of guy who could walk into any gym and immediately get respect just from the way he looked and carried himself. That kind of reputation changes how you see yourself over time. It makes you start to believe that your body is the solution to every physical problem you will ever run into. That if you are strong enough and fit enough, the environment just has to bend to you. He had done one previous high-altitude experience, a trek in Colorado that topped out around 14,000 feet. He came back from that feeling fine, no real issues, and he took that as confirmation that altitude was not going to be a problem for him. That one trip became the entire foundation of his confidence going into Nepal. What that Colorado trek was and what Nepal required were completely different things. The Colorado trip was a marked hiking trail with lower camps on both sides and the option to turn back at any point without any real consequence. Nepal was a multi-day technical climb on a remote Himalayan peak with no bailout infrastructure, no marked trail above base camp, and elevations that sat 5,000 feet higher than anything Emmerich had ever been on. The physiological gap between 14,000 feet and 19,000 feet is not just more of the same thing. The oxygen available at 19,000 feet is roughly half of what it is at sea level. At 14,000 feet, it is closer to 60%. Emmerich had no frame of reference for that gap whatsoever. Craig Thurlow was 31 years old, a construction supervisor from the same city, same gym, same mindset. Craig was physically big and had spent years doing demanding physical work on top of heavy training. He genuinely believed that made him harder to break than most people. In a lot of situations, he was probably right, but he had never climbed a mountain in any technical sense. He had never used crampons, never handled a rope on a climb, and had never been above 10,000 feet before this trip. The two of them had been dreaming up a trip like this for almost 2 years. It started as a casual conversation at the gym, the kind of thing people say and never actually follow through on. But Emmerich kept pushing it. They started looking at routes, comparing agencies, and putting real plans together. By the time they actually booked it, the idea had taken on a life of its own. In the months leading up to the trip, their preparation was almost entirely focused on the gym. Heavier lifts, more cardio, longer sessions. They were in the best physical shape of their lives by the time they got on the plane, and they knew it. What they did not do was prepare for altitude in any meaningful way. They never went on any high elevation hikes, never looked into how the body adjusts to thin air, and never spoke to anyone who had actually climbed in this part of the world. They booked through a cheap trekking agency, rented crampons that neither of them had ever put on before, and did not hire a certified high-altitude guide. They also packed the wrong clothing for anything above 17,000 feet, and at that elevation, that is not just a matter of being uncomfortable. Above 17,000 feet, the temperature at night can drop well below 0 Fahrenheit, even when conditions are relatively calm, and wind on the exposed sections of the route makes it feel even colder. Staying warm at that altitude requires specific gear built for extreme cold. a base layer that pulls moisture away from the skin, an insulating layer in the middle, and an outer shell that blocks wind and water. What Emmerich and Craig brought was closer to what you would pack for a cold camping trip in the mountains back home. Fine at lower elevations, but genuinely dangerous once you get above the snow line on a peak like this. They went with a local Sherpa team rather than a certified guide, which could have been enough if they had actually paid attention to what they were being told. Altitude is the reason this story goes the way it does, so it is worth taking a moment to explain what it actually does to the body. When you go up in elevation, the air pressure drops. There is still oxygen in the air. The percentage is the same as at sea level, but each breath delivers less of it to your lungs because the air itself is less dense. Your body can adjust to this, but it needs time. The way it does that is by producing more red blood cells, so it can carry whatever oxygen is available more efficiently. That process takes days, and there is no way around it. Being in great shape helps a little with endurance, but it does almost nothing to speed up that adjustment. A marathon runner and someone who never works out need the same acclimatization time. Fitness and altitude readiness are two completely different things. Above 15,000 feet, things start to feel different in ways that are hard to understand until you are actually standing there. Simple physical tasks become much harder than they should be. Walking at a normal pace feels like running. Your sleep gets disrupted because your breathing becomes irregular at night, and your body keeps waking itself up to take deeper breaths. You wake up exhausted even after a full night down. Your appetite drops off, and food starts feeling unappealing even when you know you need it. Headaches become a constant background presence. Most people feel some version of this even when they have acclimatized properly. When you have not acclimatized properly, the line between manageable discomfort and something genuinely dangerous gets very thin, very fast. The Sherpa team started raising concerns on the second day of the approach, though honestly the warning signs were there even earlier than that. From the moment they hit the trail, Emmerich and Craig were treating the whole thing like a competition. Out front, moving fast, barely stopping to drink water, and visibly frustrated every time the Sherpas tried to slow them down. The Sherpas had seen this before. Guys who show up in great physical shape and immediately mistake that for being ready for the mountain. They pulled the pace back, pushed them to drink and eat more, and tried to build a steady rhythm that would actually hold up over several days at that elevation. Emmerich and Craig went along with it just enough to keep things moving, then went straight back to pushing the moment no one was watching. By the end of day one, the Sherpas had already had multiple conversations with them about hydration and pace alone. Each time Emmerich had a response ready. They were fine. They felt strong. They had trained for this. The Sherpas were being overcautious. That was the answer every single time, delivered with the kind of confidence that makes it clear the person has already decided the conversation is over before it starts. The lead Sherpa tried a different approach on the morning of day 2, going through the specific reasons why the pace mattered at this elevation. Not in terms of how they felt right now, but in terms of what was building up inside their bodies that they could not feel yet. Emmerich listened and said they would be fine. Craig nodded along with him. The Sherpa had done his part. That was about all he could do. The breaking point came when the itinerary called for a full rest day at around 14,500 feet. That rest day was not padding. It was not there to stretch the trip out. Your body genuinely needs that time at that elevation before going higher, and the Sherpas had built it in because that is what the schedule is for. Emmerich refused it outright. He said they were feeling fine. He said they were athletes and their bodies could handle a faster timeline. Craig backed him up without hesitation. The lead Sherpa explained it again, not in terms of how their legs felt or how their breathing was, but in terms of what was happening inside their bodies that they could not feel yet. The kind of adjustment that has nothing to do with how strong you are. Emmerich accused the team of dragging the trip out. The conversation got heated. He made it clear that he and Craig were pushing to the next camp the following morning, regardless of what the Sherpas decided. That night, the lead Sherpa made his decision. The next morning, he took payment for the days already worked, and the team walked away. They had spent enough time on this mountain to know how this was going to end. They were not going to stick around for it. Emmerich and Craig watched them go and decided this was actually better. Without the Sherpas slowing them down, they could move at their own pace and make their own calls. They spent the rest of that day at the same camp, with no guide, no radio, and no way for anyone below to know where they were or how they were doing. Emmerich went through their gear and decided they had everything they needed. Craig agreed. They ate, talked through the route, and left that conversation feeling like the hard part was already behind them. They were about 2 days from finding out how wrong that was. They pushed to the next camp on day 3. The ascent rate was nearly double what is considered safe. The terrain above 14,500 feet in this part of Langtang is not technical in the way the bigger Himalayan peaks are, but it is relentless. Long exposed sections with loose rock underneath the snowline, steep enough that a slip without proper crampon technique becomes a serious problem fast. Neither of them had trained with crampons. They had strapped them on for the first time 2 days earlier and were still adjusting to the way they change balance and footing on uneven ground. The symptoms that had been building since day 1 were getting harder to ignore by mid-morning of day 3. Craig's head had been hurting since the previous afternoon, and the pain had not eased up overnight. He was moving slower than he had been on day 2, stopping more often, and had barely eaten at breakfast. Emmerich had thrown up that morning and put it down to something he ate the night before. He had also barely slept, waking up repeatedly through the night, but blamed it on the cold and being in an unfamiliar place. Neither of them connected any of it to what was actually happening inside their bodies. To them, this just felt like what hard physical effort was supposed to feel like. They had both pushed through discomfort before and come out fine on the other side. This felt like more of the same. The difference was that every other time they had felt like this, going home was an hour's drive away. By early afternoon, they had gained another 1,500 feet, and the terrain had steepened considerably. The wind had picked up, and the temperature had dropped enough that exposed skin was uncomfortable within minutes. Craig was visibly laboring on the steeper sections, his breathing audible and his pace inconsistent. He would move steadily for a stretch and then slow almost to a stop before picking back up again. Emmerich was pulling ahead on the steeper sections and waiting at natural rest points. Neither of them talked much. At that elevation, conversation starts to feel like an unnecessary use of energy, and by that point, both of them were conserving everything they had just to keep moving. They made camp that night at around 16,200 feet. The temperature dropped sharply after dark, and the wind came in hard, sustained gusts that rattled the tent. Craig's headache had not improved. He took something for it and lay down. Emmerich ate almost nothing for dinner and told himself he would eat more in the morning. Morning came, and he barely touched that either. When they finally settled in for the night, Craig sat outside the tent for a while before coming in. He was not looking at the view. He was just sitting there, still, staring at nothing in particular. Inside the tent, he mentioned his head was still bad. Emmerich told him to drink more water. That was the extent of the conversation. Neither of them said out loud what the symptoms were actually pointing to. Neither of them allowed for the possibility that what they were feeling was anything more than the normal wear of a hard climb. They had been telling each other they were fine, and by that point, it had become the only response either of them had left. The next morning, they broke camp early and pushed for high camp at 17,800 feet. The final stretch is one of the more exposed sections of the route, a long rising traverse with significant drop exposure on one side and no real anchor points. They moved through it slowly and without speaking. By the time they reached high camp, both men were running on very little. High camp sits on a narrow shelf of rock and compacted snow, with the upper slope rising steeply above, and nothing but open air below. At that elevation, the cold works differently than anything most people have felt before. It gets into your gear, into your joints, and it does not let go. Craig's headache had been running continuously for over 24 hours. Emmerich had stopped eating almost entirely. They were dehydrated, underfueled, and operating at a level of oxygen deprivation that was already starting to affect their thinking. That is the part about altitude sickness that makes it so hard to catch from the inside. It chips away at the exact judgment you need to recognize that something is wrong. The forecast had been available to them before they ever left base camp. A weather system was moving in from the northwest and was expected to hit the upper elevations within 48 hours of their projected summit day. They knew this. It was not a surprise. They looked at that forecast and decided they would be off the mountain before it got there. They set their alarm for 3 in the morning. Neither of them slept. The wind was already audible outside the tent, coming in long, uneven gusts that made the fabric snap and pull against the poles. Craig's headache had not improved despite the medication he had taken earlier. He lay there in the dark, not sleeping, not saying anything. Emmerich was awake too. The storm was clearly not going to wait the 48 hours they had planned around. Both of them could feel that from inside the tent. They got up at 3 in the morning anyway. They left high camp on the morning of October 7th while it was still completely dark. It was around 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was already coming hard out of the northwest. The slope above camp is steep and completely exposed, the kind of terrain that gives you nowhere to hide when the weather turns. Reaching the summit ridge means crossing a long stretch of angled snow before the route tilts up sharply toward the top. With good conditions, proper equipment, and someone who knew the route, it was a climb that could be done. What they had was rented crampons, no rope between them, and a storm already moving in. Those are not the same conditions. Both men were struggling before they had gained 500 feet above high camp. The pace that had defined the entire trip was gone. They were moving slowly, stopping frequently, and the stops were getting longer. At around 18,500 feet, Emmerich sat down for nearly 20 minutes. He got back up and kept going. Craig was moving mechanically, one foot in front of the other, not talking, not looking around, just moving. His coordination was visibly off. Small things at first, a half step sideways to catch his balance, a hand going down to the snow on sections that did not require it, the kind of adjustments a body makes when it is not getting enough oxygen to process the terrain properly. His breathing was audible from several feet away, labored and uneven in a way that had nothing to do with the steepness of the slope. He had been symptomatic for well over 30 hours by this point, and every step upward was making it worse. The wind had increased significantly by the time they cleared 19,000 feet. Visibility was dropping as the cloud layer that had been sitting on the horizon since before dawn started moving in, faster than either of them had anticipated. The temperature had fallen further, and the wind chill on the exposed face was well below zero. No rope between them, no guide, no radio, insufficient gear, climbing into deteriorating conditions on a mountain that had been giving them clear signals to stop for 3 days straight. By the time they reached around 19,200 feet, roughly 600 feet below the summit, Craig stopped moving. He just sat down in the snow. There was no build-up to it. He was moving, and then he was not. Emmerich was ahead of him on the slope and turned back when he realized Craig was no longer behind him. Craig was not making any sense when Emmerich tried to talk to him. He was moving his hands slowly across his jacket like he was trying to work out what he was touching. His eyes were open, but he was not focusing on anything. He did not react to movement. He did not respond to his name. His body was there, but everything else was gone. Getting him down was the only option. Waiting to see if he came around was not something they had time for. Every minute they stayed at that elevation was making things worse, and getting to lower ground was the only thing that could actually help him. Emmerich stood there at 19,200 feet, with the wind cutting across the slope and the summit 600 feet above him. Craig was against the rock, unresponsive, in conditions that were getting worse by the hour. Getting him down from that point would have meant physically managing him across a steep exposed traverse and building wind and dropping visibility. It would have meant giving up the summit entirely. Emmerich had been on that mountain 4 days. He had pushed through the symptoms, the arguments, the Sherpa walkout, 2 nights of almost no sleep and barely any food. The summit was 600 feet away. He propped Craig against a rock outcropping, left him sitting in the snow at 19,200 feet in 11-degree weather with the wind building around him, and kept climbing. A GPS watch recovered afterward logged Emmerich reaching the summit ridge at approximately 8:40 in the morning. The wind by that point had increased to the kind of speed that makes standing upright difficult on exposed terrain. The device showed him stationary at the summit ridge for about 25 minutes. 25 minutes at nearly 20,000 feet in those conditions is a long time to be stationary. In severe wind and dropping visibility, with a brain that was not getting enough oxygen to function properly, the most likely explanation is that he could not locate the descent route. The traverse line back across the snow face to high camp starts at a specific point on the summit ridge, and in clear conditions, it is visible. In the cloud and wind that had moved in by that point, it would have been extremely difficult to identify, especially for someone whose spatial reasoning and decision-making were already compromised. He may have been standing there trying to work out which direction to go, moving a few steps one way and then stopping, trying another direction, unable to hold a coherent thought long enough to commit to a route. When movement resumed, it was immediately wrong. Short distances, inconsistent directions, the kind of track that looks like someone wandering rather than descending with any purpose. His brain, already running on fumes from days of insufficient acclimatization and now pushed to nearly 20,000 feet, was not working well enough to navigate a descent on steep terrain in low visibility. By 10:15 in the morning, the watch stopped recording. The device was found later partially buried in wind-driven snow about 340 feet below the summit ridge. Emmerich was not with it. Craig was found exactly where Emmerich had left him, seated against the rock outcropping at 19,200 feet. He had not moved. His pack was still on his back. His gloves had been partially removed, which happens in the final stages of severe cold exposure, when the body's signals get crossed and a person feels hot even as they are freezing. His camera was still in his jacket pocket. The last photo on it was time-stamped the previous afternoon at high camp. Nobody knew they were in trouble for 2 days. There was no check-in system, no one at base camp waiting on a scheduled call, no one tracking their position. The trekking agency had their general itinerary, but had no way of knowing they had blown past the schedule, or that they had pushed for the summit on a day when the weather was already moving in. When they did not come back down on the expected day, there was no immediate alarm because the expected day was already based on a plan they had abandoned days earlier. From the outside, everything looked like a trip running a little behind. A separate climbing group, descending from an adjacent route, spotted Craig on October 9th, 2 days after the summit push. They reported the location when they reached base camp. A recovery team reached the site the following day. Craig was recovered from the position he had been left in. The evidence at the scene was consistent with someone who had lost the ability to move or make decisions well before he was found. Emmerich's recovery took longer. The weather system that had been in the forecast before they ever left. Base camp moved through the upper elevations and shut down search efforts for several days. When conditions cleared, 11 days after the summit, a search team reached the upper slope and found him 190 feet below, where the GPS watch had last recorded movement, face down on a steep section of the slope. The position and the injuries were consistent with a fall during the descent in near zero visibility and severe wind. The case was reviewed by local mountaineering authorities and closed. Emmerich's cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries sustained in a fall with severe disorientation as a contributing factor. Craig's cause of death was listed as high-altitude cerebral edema with hypothermia as a secondary factor. Contributing factors in both cases included failure to acclimatize, dismissal of guide recommendations, inadequate equipment for the conditions, and continuation of ascent after visible symptom onset in both individuals. The GPS watch data, the time-stamped photographs recovered from Craig's camera, and the full account provided by the Sherpa team gave investigators a clear picture of how everything unfolded. The Sherpa team was interviewed, their account documented in full, and they were cleared without question. The review concluded that their decision to withdraw was professionally sound and consistent with standard safety protocol. The case was closed with no further action.